Julio Cortázar. Continuity of the parks. Commented reading. In this short story, we can find the main characteristics that make the writer of Rayuela, Hopscotch, one of the greatest masters of Latin American and world literature. By Fernando Schell. There are many literary aspects that we can analyze when we approach Julio Cortázar. We can analyze his importance as a novelist and the relevance of his novel for the Latin American literature, or his social essays, and even his work as a teacher. But this time, I will address a story that came out in 1964 and is part of the second edition of the book Final del Juego, End of the Game, edited by Editorial Sudamericana. It's an analysis on the story Continuidad de los Parques, Continuity of the Parks. I chose this short story mainly because we can find there the main features that make the writer of Hopscotch one of the greatest masters of Latin American and world literature. In a few lines of the story, we meet the short story master, the author who broke the molds, canons, and stereotypes of the mainstream literature of his time. There is also a time and speech transgression, as well as an exquisite breakpoint between reality and fantasy. The main topic of this short story is the continuity established between two fiction worlds. The first world, which we will call primary fiction, is the reality of a man who is reading a novel. The first world ends up linked to a second fictional world, the world of the characters of the novel the man is reading. The places where the two worlds meet are precisely the parks, the park of the novel reader, primary fiction, and the park of the woods in the lover's cabin, secondary fiction, that end up melting, fusing, continuing. As we can see, the title of the short story is present in the main topic of it. Regarding the external or formal structure of the story, we can see it is divided in two paragraphs that somehow correspond to their thematic content. Even if there are three moments in the narration, the first two come together in the first paragraph, and the last moment comes in its totality in the last paragraph. The first moment of the story focuses on what I call primary fiction and brings the presentation of the reading man and the world surrounding him. Among this first big paragraph, we also find the second moment, which I called secondary fiction, and which point of interest are the events of the novel that the reader character is reading. Finally, in the third moment, which we can find in the third paragraph, we meet the fantastic element of the story, the fusion of both fictions. He had begun to read the novel a few days before. He had put it aside because of some urgent business conferences, opened it again on his way back to the estate by train. He permitted himself a slowly growing interest in the plot, in the characterizations. That afternoon, after writing a letter giving his power of attorney and discussing a matter of joint ownership with the manager of his estate, he returned to the book in the tranquility of his study which looked out upon the park with its oaks. Cortázar, 1964. The intention of the author of the story is raised from the beginning. His interest is that we focus in those aspects that make the central idea of the story, the fusion of two fictional worlds. That's why he chooses not to give us physical or psychological information on the reader character, as they are meaningless for the plot of the story. Only thing that matters is how the character works on the story. Nevertheless, the omniscient narrator gives certain information about the life of the reader, but this information will be at the plot's service. In the first stage of the story, in short, both fictions are already approached, the reader and the novel. The main thing here is to quickly focus on the importance that the novel will end up having for its reader. References about urgent businesses, about his attorney and his butler are working in two ways, showing the state of wealth and welfare of the reader character and, on the other side, how this protagonist finished all his chores in order to sit and read peacefully. For the events that are going to arise in the story, it was necessary that the reading character was totally relaxed, so the fiction he was reading would absorb him totally. Tranquility offered by his studio, whose window had a view to the Oaks Park, makes the perfect place to let the character go inside the plot of the novel. Sprawled in his favorite armchair, its back toward the door, even the possibility of an intrusion would have irritated him. Had he thought of it, he let his left hand caress repeatedly the green velvet upholstery and set to reading the final chapters. Cortázar, 1964. In this brief but convincing narration, all the elements that appear are an important part of the story. They are not there just for decoration. Logically, Cortázar knew perfectly the way in which fantasy was going to be present in the story when he planned it, the mixture between both fictional worlds. We can notice two meaningful elements in that part of the reading, the green velvet armchair and the fact that he has his back toward the door so he cannot be interrupted in his reading. When the killer, who belongs to the secondary fiction, comes totally into the reader's world, he will enter precisely through that door, and will find him with his back toward the door. The bases for fantasy are already set. There is a reader who tries all the possible means to focus and enter the world of the novel, but the extraordinary thing here is that the novel's world ends up entering the reader's world. He remembered effortlessly the names and his mental image of the characters. The novel spread its glamour over him almost at once. He tasted the almost perverse pleasure of disengaging himself line by line from the things around him, and at the same time feeling his head rest comfortably on the green velvet of the chair with its high back, sensing that the cigarettes rested within reach of his hand, that beyond the great windows the air of the sunset danced under the oak trees in the park. Cortázar, 1964. It was not difficult for the novel to seduce the reader. He had already looked for the appropriate place to read the final chapters and remembered the events of the novel. He is surrounded by comfort, and the surrounding objects are directly linked to pleasure. Let's think about the softness of velvet, cigarettes within reach of his hands, and even in the image of the air, which is portrayed as a person dancing, everything helps to create an illusion of pleasure. The use of the metaphor disengaging himself line by line, on the one hand, shows us how the reader detaches from his environment, and on the other hand, prepares the field so the narrator begins to tell the story that was happening inside the novel. Another meaningful element on this paragraph in the service of fantasy is the reference to the time of the day in which the events occur. In the primary fiction, events occur in the sunset, while in the secondary fiction, we are told that it is beginning to get dark. If we pay attention to the fictions about to blend, we notice that it is the same hour, and that continuity is also present in this aspect. Word by word, licked up the sordid dilemma of the hero and heroine, letting himself be absorbed to the point where the images settled down and took on color and movement, he was witness to the final encounter in the mountain cabin, Cortázar, 1964. This section is pretty important, for it closes the first moment of the story. We have witnessed the presentation of the reading man and his world and surroundings. We have witnessed how the writer has been preparing the immersion into the secondary fiction, to the events that happen in the novel that is being read. The first line in which the novel is alluded to is, sordid dilemma of the hero and heroine, and there we face the secondary fiction. It is in this part of the story where we find grammatical alternation between both worlds. On the one hand, we have a character that lets himself be absorbed, and similar expressions referring to the primary fiction. On the other hand, we have the sordid dilemma of the hero and the heroine, and the color and movement of the images that belong to the second fictional world. The plot of the novel which amazes and absorbs the reader is referring to a very special encounter. The characters in the secondary fiction are facing a sordid dilemma, which implies the characters are in the middle of something shady, evil. Another anticipation of what is about to happen in the continuation of the second part of the story is the fact that the images of the novel took color and movement, as if they were coming alive, and the reader becomes a mere spectator. That is why Cortázar chooses the word witness to allude to the reader in the final paragraph of the moment. In order to be a witness of something, he must be present in the place of the events, and this reader is so immersed in his reading that he feels as if he were watching the happenings. At last, he refers the place where the events of the secondary fiction are taking place. The woman arrived first, apprehensive. Now the lover came in, his face cut by the backlash of a branch. Admirably, she stanched the blood with her kisses, but he rebuffed her caresses. He had not come to perform again the ceremonies of a secret passion, protected by a world of dry leaves and furtive paths through the forest. The dagger warmed itself against his chest, and underneath liberty pounded, hidden close. Cortázar, 1964. First thing we notice when we face this second moment of the story's internal structure is the change in the narrator's point of view. The events being told now are the same events that the character is reading, and we become witnesses of these images that have taken color and movement. In this part, we meet the hero and heroine whom have decided to meet in that cabin to solve that sordid dilemma. They are a couple of lovers who use this lonely place for their love encounters, but it seems that in this occasion, the purpose of the meeting is quite different. The presentation of these characters is made directly. We get to know them by their actions, and there are no physical or psychological descriptions of any of the characters, just like the reading character. The woman arrived first to the cabin, but she seemed to be suspicious, prevented, and afraid of the meeting. When her lover arrives, she sees that he is hurt by the lash of a branch, a signal of how dense is the vegetation in the proximities of the cabin. There is an interesting scene where vampirism is present, and it happens when the woman stops her lover's bleeding just by kissing him. In this part, blood can work as a symbolic element that, on the one hand, refers to the passion of the lovers, and on the other hand, is giving us a clue about the death to come. The man rejects her caresses. It shows that this encounter will be different than the others. They will carry out a transcendental action, and it is not just a regular encounter like the others. There is a dagger, as a symbol of freedom, a dagger that is getting warm, and also a prosopopoeia in the concept of freedom, assuming that liberty is hidden, waiting for the moment to give the final blow. A lustful, panting dialogue raced down the pages like a rivulet of snakes, and one felt it had all been decided from eternity. Even to those caresses which writhed about the lover's body, as though wishing to keep him there, to dissuade him from it, they sketched abominably the fame of that other body it was necessary to destroy. Nothing had been forgotten: alibis, unforeseen hazards, possible mistakes. Cortázar, 1964. The use of the prosopopoeia can be seen in this part of the story too. Now the writer gives human characteristics to the dialogue of the novel. This dialogue is lustful, wishful, and it is at the same time compared to a rivulet of snakes, which implies that it is dangerous and treacherous. We are told that the dialogue raced down the pages, and these pages are none but the reader's novel, something that takes us back to the primary fiction amidst this second moment of the story. It is very important that, as readers, we do not miss the fact that the lovers of the cabin are characters of a secondary fiction, and that is why the narrator reminds it referencing the pages of the novel. The concept of destiny is present in the sentence, and one felt it had been decided from eternity, the actions being taken by the characters and the passive attitude of the reader towards the happenings in which he will end up involved. He had no idea that he was that other body it was necessary to destroy. The efforts of the woman to stop her lover were worthless. It was necessary to reach the objective, freedom. It had all been decided from eternity. Nothing had been forgotten: alibis, unforeseen hazards, possible mistakes. From this hour on, each instant had its use minutely assigned. The cold-blooded, twice gone over re-examination of the details was barely broken off so that a hand could caress a cheek. It was beginning to get dark. Cortázar, 1964. This is the last part of the narration's second moment in its internal structure. Everything is ready for the final step, the fantastical mixture of both realities. The lovers of the cabin have everything carefully planned: alibis, unforeseen hazards, possible mistakes. Amidst this meticulous planning, they only had time to show their passion to each other. Other meaningful element in the final part of the second moment is the reference to the time of the day in which the facts happen. Let's remember that the reader sat in front of the Oaks Park at sunset, and the lovers are ready to act when it was beginning to get dark, which means the time of the day is the same in both fictions. Not looking at each other now, rigidly fixed upon the task which awaited them, they separated at the cabin door. She was to follow the trail that led north. On the path leading in the opposite direction, he turned for a moment to watch her running, her hair loosened and flying. Cortázar, 1964. This is the beginning of the story's second paragraph, which coincides with the third moment of the internal structure. We have arrived to the point where the fantasy will definitely happen, where impossible things will occur, where two fictions will be mixed and continued. Now the lovers are only physically apart, because they are rigidly fixed upon the task of the assassination. The only moment that might not have a specific task is when the man turns his head to look at his lover and her loose hair. It feels like if the image of his lover encourages him to commit the crime that will lead them to an ultimate freedom. He ran in turn, crouching among the trees and hedges until, in the yellowish fog of dusk, he could distinguish the avenue of trees which led up to the house. Cortázar, 1964. At the beginning of this literary analysis, when I stated the main topic of the story, I said that it was about the continuity established between two fictional worlds. I also added that continuity was conceived precisely in the parts that end up mixing. Well, those trees, hedges and furtive paths among the trees he is reading in his novel, precisely the surroundings of his home. The trees surrounding the mountain's cabin, secondary fiction, are continued in the trees that lead to the author's home, primary fiction. Yellowish fog of dusk fills the scene with a fantastic nature, generating an indefinite where continuity is possible. The dogs were not supposed to bark, and they did not bark. The estate manager would not be there at this hour, and he was not there. He went up the 3 porch steps and entered. The woman's words reached him over a thudding of blood in his ears, first a blue chamber, then a hall, then a carpeted stairway. At the top, 2 doors. No one in the first room, no one in the second. The door of the salon, and then, the knife in his hand, the light from the great windows, the high back of an armchair covered in green velvet, the head of the man in the chair reading a novel. Cortázar, 1964. This last fragment is very important, as it makes us know the motivation of the crime, love. Even if the woman of the cabin is never linked to the character who reads, she undoubtedly has a sentimental relationship with him. We are not told that this woman is the wife or lover of the reading character, but it is logical to think that he was the other body it was necessary to destroy, so she and her lover can live in absolute freedom. Apart of this, we have enough proof that she knew all of the house's corners perfectly. It's the words of this woman what reach him over a thudding of blood in his ear. It was her who gave the indications to her lover and partner in crime about how he should proceed and the things he was going to find. The lover reminds the words of the woman, and the images flow one after another. The killer advances through the house until he reaches the room. The reference to the green velvet armchair is the climax of fantasy, showing that the man who reads the novel is undoubtedly the reading character of the primary fiction. Anyhow, the story has an open ending. Everything seems to show that the crime was accomplished, and the man who was sat in the green velvet armchair was reading his own death.